Let's start in Ghana, where China has sent a special delegation to engage the West African country's government, seeking an amicable solution to the problem of illegal mining, which has plagued Ghana recently. The crackdown on illegal mining activities within the country's borders has attracted quite a bit of attention to Ghana this month, with concerns raised within and without the country. Now, the delegation has already met Ghana's Vice President, Kwesi Boke Amisa Arthur, and reported that the outcome was pretty encouraging. CCTV's Penina Karebe is in Accra in Ghana. She joins us now with the latest on this developing story. Penina, some of the key issues that have been dealt with this particular issue is that China has essentially said they're willing to assist Ghana in resolving the problem of illegal mining. What specific measures, however, will be taken?
Well, Rama, like you mentioned there, this special delegation from Beijing that comprises of officials from the Ministry of Public Security, Commerce and Foreign Affairs did meet with the Vice President. Of course, that's among other high officials from within Ghana's government. And they've been here for a week. This morning, they called a press conference just to give an update of what's been happening between the two teams. And what we heard from them, they didn't really give specifics of what it is they would be doing as a special team from China to help Ghana resolve this issue. But one of the things that came out of this press conference, Rama, is that the Chinese embassy has actually been trying hard enough, like they said, to try and cut this vice. Now, we heard from the ambassador, China's ambassador to Ghana. He said that the embassy, as early as 2 years ago, translated Ghana's mining laws into Chinese and posted these laws on their website. And this was to ensure that all the Chinese nationals who come into Ghana are well acquainted with the laws. Of course, you can see, Rama, by what we're seeing on the ground, this hasn't really done enough. So what the team said this morning was that the embassy will now introduce a new scheme where all Chinese nationals who are coming into Ghana will be required to register with the embassy, and that way the embassy can keep a keen eye on what these nationals are and what activities they're engaging in, Rama.
Indeed. Let's focus our attention on the crackdown, however. What's the latest on that? Is it still in progress? Have more individuals been captured? What's the latest?
Well, you know, Ramba, we haven't been getting a lot from, out of that crackdown. But what I can tell you is that on the weekend, we flew to Kumasi. This is a town that is in Ashanti region, a very well-known gold-rich region here in Ghana. We did speak with the local authorities there, and they told us the crackdown is very much on course. They said that the government has been making announcements on national radio, encouraging all these foreign illegal miners to come out of the mines, and those with legitimate visas will be facilitated to get out. And they gave us numbers of those foreigners that have actually heeded this call. They said within the past week, about 476 illegal miners actually came out. They asked the government to facilitate the movement from the mines, because these mines are located deep in Ghana's rural areas. So they were given transport out of these mines and into Kumasi town. And by the time we got there, which was on Saturday, there were quite a good number of them that had put up in these hotels. Now, like I mentioned, Rama, these are people with legitimate visas. What they lack are legitimate permits to help them engage in the kind of activities they've been engaging in. So on Sunday, Rama, we witnessed some of these people actually leaving the country and going back to wherever they came from. And the Vice President pointed out that those are not just Chinese nationalities, they're of mixed nationalities. We understand that even Americans here have been engaging in these illegal activities. So yes, Rama, the crackdown very much well on course. The Chinese team here saying that even if the government here is conducting the crackdown, then it should be done in a humane way, because there's been reports of attacks and vicious attacks in that matter, and even looting of these foreigners, Rama.
Right, Penina, explain to me how this works, because under Ghanaian law, artisanal mining, small-scale mining of this sort, is reserved strictly for citizens of Ghana alone. So how then do we end up with hundreds, if not thousands, of foreign nationals working in this sector, where locals being used as a legal front of sorts?
I know, confusing, isn't it, Rama? But this is a question we posed to the Vice President last week. And this is the interesting bit about this whole scenario. The Vice President said that Ghanaians are very much to blame, as are these illegal miners that are coming into the country. And he gave us an example in regards especially to the Chinese miners who've come into this country illegally. He says that he has information that some Ghanaian companies have gone to China and have enticed the Chinese because they know the Chinese productivity. They've enticed entice them to come into Ghana and engage in these illegal activities. And this is because Rama, the vice president, says it's like some kind of deal has been struck where they know the Chinese will come in, they'll come in with these high-tech equipment, and they will be able to reap huge profits, which then can be split between the locals and the foreign miners. Now, when we went down to the mines last week, Rama, we spoke to a few locals in the central region, and again, they reiterated what the vice president had said. They said that these Chinese and other foreign nationals that are mining illegally there are not really the landowners. The blacks, so to speak, get this land for them, lease it to them, and these people just mainly just pay for this land for a period of time and engage in this activity. The excavators used to mine these gold, Rama, is leased out or rented out to these nationals by the locals. So we are seeing an illegal collaboration of Ghanaians and these foreigners who come into this country. And this is what the vice president talked to us about, Rama. He said they know, as government, there are existing loopholes here, and they're trying to actually seal all these loopholes, Rama.
Indeed. We'll have to leave you there for the time being. Thank you very much for that update. That's CCTV's Penina Karibe live in the Ghanaian capital of Accra. Now, let's talk about trade, specifically in Africa. The continent as a whole trades much more with the outside world than with the countries within its borders. And that's a situation which experts warn is terrible for business. Statistics from the New York Forum on Africa indicate that intra-African trade accounts for just 13% of the continent's total. While in Gabon, CCTV's Peter Okaba spoke to Stella Kilonzo, founder and chief executive of Astute Capital, an African investment and trade advisory firm. Their conversation started with a look at intra-African trade so far.
We are trading with non-African partners, in terms of just that difference. But within Africa, we are only at 13%, and that situation is very bleak. 2 years ago, we were at 10%, so it's great we've increased by 3%, but 3% is still not good enough. Central Africa has done very well with that. We have seen a bit of movement in that area, and some parts of also West Africa. There have been increased trade amongst each other, but we could do better.
Why is it so difficult to do trade in Africa, Africans trading with Africa, intra-Africa trade? Why is that so difficult? Because
of the barriers that we have created. What you call the non-tariff barriers are very high. There's a question of sovereignty. Sovereignty is the one that actually surmounts everything else. When you look even in our financial markets, the whole idea of sovereignty, everyone wants to have a stock exchange, everyone wants to have their own. So the whole idea is really for us at this present time to change our mindset. Starting with the leadership all the way to ourselves. Yes. It's not even just the leaders, but it's us to change our mindset. That's the only thing that will change first. If we change the mindset, then we can say, how do we open Africa for business? Or how do we open our own countries for business with each other? So more engagement, but other than just talk, each one has to deal with their own national law. And you don't want to be seen to break the law if you're an officer. For example, at the tax authority, you don't want to break the law. Yeah. So even if there's been a resolution that has been made at the regional level, at the end of the day, you still have to deal with this national law, which says you have to tax goods from this country, or you have to charge a visa fee from someone who's coming from Africa. So that's when these resolutions are made at the regional level, or at maybe the heads of states level, then they have to be cascaded to the national level so that it actually impacts on the national laws.
The key thing about Central and West Africa is that they've sort of moved along on the road to integration. For example, the Central African states, they have the CFA, a common currency, and there's so many other things that others have been trying. If you take ECOWAS, they've even had a bank set up, which is now EcoBank. Does this prove that moving along on the road towards further integration actually does make doing business easier, and that there are benefits to that?
These are fine examples of where the mindsets have met and said, let's do business together. And so you have that. And then what they further did at the ECOWAS level is they actually imposed a tax on goods that are coming to that region, which was so great because that tax was not used for paying salaries, but it was actually used to strengthen the regional body that would actually facilitate these transactions to go on. So I would say that the regional currency is a good thing, and I know that even East African is looking at having a common East African Monetary Union, and also there are steps towards having an integrated RTGS.
So basically a means of settlement for financial transactions.
Yes, so these are the steps that are being undertaken, and they are going to be the ones that will help in terms of also increasing trade, because there may not necessarily be a common currency immediately, but just having that settlement being undertaken as a region is a big step for us.
Let's move on to North Africa now, where France has received a formal request from Egypt to delay payments for wheat imports as the world's largest importer of the grain grapples with a prolonged economic crisis. France is the European Union's top wheat exporter and is also one of Egypt's leading suppliers. Officials in the country are studying the request, and France has indicated its willingness to help Egypt through this difficult financial period. CCTV's Yasser Kim has the details.
Egypt consumes over 20 million tons of wheat annually, and half of it is imported at an average $3.5 billion, mostly for bread consumption, the main food item in every Egyptian home. Concerns have been growing over the country's ability to sustain purchases amid an acute economic crisis.
Wheat imports have been gradually increasing in the last few years because local farmers opted for other profitable crops. There is also the problem of storage, which is quite outdated and leads to the loss of huge amounts during transportation.
This is why Egypt requested assistance from France in building grain silos, stocking wheat for Egypt in France for free, and 9 to 12 months payment facilities on imported French wheat. Meanwhile, the government has announced plans to totally stop imports of wheat by 2017.
The government is buying wheat crop from farmers at international prices as an incentive for more production. It is trying to develop the storing capabilities and has also been studying reducing subsidies on bread to reduce consumption and imports of wheat.
Already this year, imports have dropped by 10%, made up through increased local production. The leadership sees the success of this plan will not only lead to less imports of wheat, but less burden on the budget, more cultivated land, and more importantly, self-sufficiency in the main food item for the Egyptian people. This is Yasser Hakim for CCTV, Cairo.
It's just about 17:40 GMT. We're taking a short break here on BizAfrica. Here's what's coming up next. G8 leaders wrap up their summit in Northern Ireland. We'll look at what their decisions mean for Africa.
BizAsia. Asia means business.
Welcome back. The European Union and the United States have launched formal talks on one of the world's most ambitious free trade agreements, promising millions of jobs and economic growth on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, if this deal comes into force, it will link regions which account for almost half of the world's entire economic output and a third of its trade, while creating an estimated 2 million jobs. The deal is projected to be worth about £100 billion to the Eurozone economy, $80 billion to the United States and £85 billion more to the rest of the world. Now, the plan was first considered about 3 decades ago, but it was vetoed back then by France, which wanted to shield its film and culture sectors from Hollywood. This time, though, France is seen to be supportive of such a trade deal.
This meeting in Lochern is to fire up our economies and drive growth and prosperity around the world, to do things that make a real difference to people's lives. And there is no more powerful way to achieve that than by boosting trade. And there's no better way than by launching these negotiations on a landmark deal between the European Union and the United States of America.
The U.S.-EU relationship is the largest in the world. It makes up nearly half of global GDP. We trade about $1 trillion in goods and services each year. We invest nearly $4 trillion in each other's economies, and all that supports around 13 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. And this potentially groundbreaking partnership would deepen those ties.
This is of key strategic significance. Ladies and gentlemen, the Atlantic is not the past.
Clearly, then, one must not waste a good crisis. Let me take it back to 2009, though. The G8 summit in Italy ended in that year with a call for more international cooperation to fight corruption, tax evasion, money laundering and terrorism finance. 4 years later, the talk is pretty much the same with the G8. So is there any real reason to be optimistic about any changes in policy today? Let's find out. Alan Kamau, CCTV's Africa business commentator. He's in our studios here in Nairobi. Melanie Ralph also joins us on the line from London. Melanie, let's start with you. Walk us through the main elements at stake here with the deal between the United States and the EU.
Well, let's look at the numbers first. The analysts are already predicting that no trade barriers means GDP of the EU will go up by 190 billion euros. The US will go up by about 100 billion euros. The essence of this deal would be to tackle tariffs and regulations, bringing down the costs of trade and getting rid of the red tape and generating millions of jobs. The other main issue is to close the gap in potential growth between the industrialized countries in the emerging markets. So some experts are hoping that the US and the EU agreement will prompt emerging market powerhouses like China and India to become more responsible, possibly partners at the global level.
Indeed. Alan, coming to you here in Nairobi. These two regions between them account for about half of global economic output. Where does Africa fit into the deal?
I think Africa does fit in. Much has been made of this deal between the US and the EU, and like you say, they account for a large part of global output. Africa needs the developing world to recover because it is a big source of income for Africa. And so I think it must be seen as a good thing. I think the difficulty with this is that these types of deals are not good in terms of rebalancing the global trade architecture. And they don't help to promote the type of action that is required to provide greater access. We know that Africa accounts for only 3 or 4% of global trade. That trade tends to be concentrated in commodities and in primary goods. And so what is needed is real action that allows African countries to expand that trade and to have fair access. And so while I think the G8 was very good at identifying the right issues, trade, transparency, tax, I think what we're seeing is very little detail about how that will redress global imbalances and help African countries have a really reasonable chance to get a greater share of trade and lift people out of poverty.
Let's expand on that argument. Melanie, in London, with these two sides focusing on a bilateral trade agreement, where does that leave the WTO and the Doha round of trade talks? Wouldn't it essentially be fair to say that that round of talks is more or less dead in the water?
Well, Emma, that's the fear here, that this transatlantic deal will undermine multilateral deals like the long overdue completion of the Doha round and weaken multinational institutions such as the World Trade Organization. If bilateral deals like this are going to dominate the picture, the impetus to push ahead with more complex multinational agreements will fall away. That being said, the bilateral deal between the US and EU isn't going to happen overnight. Some say ripping down the trade barriers between two of the world's largest economies is going to take until the end of next year at least. And that's just getting the two economic heavyweights to sign on the dotted line. So it's unlikely that we'll see any effect of this agreement for a couple of years yet. But certainly this bilateral deal is likely to be easier to close than the multilateral ones.
Alan, let's move on to taxes with respect to the G8. Out of the 10-point action plan on taxes and company registration that they released earlier today, actions to tackle transfer pricing or transfer mispricing were conspicuously absent. Now, given the fact that African economies lose about $60 billion a year through this illicit outflows, isn't that a grievous oversight?
It is a grievous oversight. I think on the issue of tax, I think the G8 has sort of smelt the coffee, but has been very weak on the detail and on the action to address this. What we had hoped to see were two things. One was a system that would allow African governments and citizens to be able to understand who are the owners of assets and how much revenue can be clawed out of those resources. So you think about African countries like Nigeria or Zambia that are exporting primary goods. There's a view that these countries don't have, or the citizens do not have a good view as to where who are the real beneficiaries of the sale of those goods. And so what has been agreed through the G8 is what is essentially a private list. It will be a system that will allow rich countries essentially to be able to share the information between themselves. I think this is seen as not going far enough. I think what would have been good would have been a system that would allow private citizens, institutions, civil society, and the full scope of stakeholders to be able to assess what are the revenues that are accruing to these African countries. We know that African countries are suffering huge deficits. They have a very, very shallow tax base and frankly rely quite heavily on these revenues from resources. And so lack of transparency around that really is a huge, huge issue that would have required greater action from the G8, I think.
Melanie, we do know what the United Kingdom plans to do off that 10-point action plan, but what about the other G8 members? What's their action plan on enhancing transparency in company ownership?
Yeah, that's the key question here. The UK is certainly spearheading the way to make the tax system more open and accessible. Headway has been made to get more strict on companies, getting them to reveal the true owners to the tax authorities. Whether we'll actually see tax legislation change to support this is now the big question. The other sticking point is whether to make registers of information public. As it stands, there's still resistance to that too. Besides the call for public registers, G8 members have agreed to automatic exchanges of information between tax authorities. In addition to this, there's a push for more transparency from mining firms. Some major mining companies use complex ownership structures to avoid paying taxes on the minerals they extract in developing countries, and this should make it easier for developing countries to collect the taxes owed to them.
Indeed. We'll have to leave it there for the time being. Thank you very much for your insight. Alan Kamar, business commentator here in Nairobi, and Melanie Ralph in London. We'll have to leave it there for the time being. Over to South Africa now. A young teenager in Africa's largest economy is taking the lead in helping to educate others. Matshidiso has published her first poetry book and is giving away all the proceeds to a bursary fund for students who want to become accountants. Now, the former South African president, Thabo Mbeki, was so moved by her actions, he got involved. Our CCTV's Sumitra Naidu now reports.
We drive ourselves to forget, to vanquish the thoughts that conceals our actions. We blind our minds to see forth what our eyes will accept. It pains us to remember. We want to forget.
Matshidiso Tlelai is just 18 years old and is already being described as a future leader. The grade 12 pupil was inspired to write poetry after the death of her uncle 4 years ago. She found poetry to be a way of expressing her emotions. Matshidiso writes about love, hope, forgiveness and hatred, and is now giving inspiration to others.
I have the potential and I have the opportunity to go to America to study whatever I want to study. And there's some kids out there that can't live their dreams because they have to focus on having food on their tables. So I just saw how hugely unfair that was. So I chose the Tutuka Fund, not just because I'm not going to be an accountant, but I saw the Tutuka Fund as a way of giving to other people so that they can live their dreams just like how I have the potential to live mine.
The Tutuka Bursary Fund was started in the Eastern Cape to help young, aspiring, underprivileged and previously disadvantaged students to follow their dreams of becoming chartered accountants.
The program was started in 2002 after we recognized that there was a need to do something different, not just provide bursaries, but provide a holistic support program for students that come from disadvantaged backgrounds.
Beneficiaries of the fund who attend universities all over the country say they are inspired by what Matshidiso is doing.
It's amazing that a child her age is got the heart that she does to give away her proceeds and to even identify that there is this need, in our general population, in our culture, in our society.
We're in a position where we need young leaders that are taking initiative, where they're showing kindness towards others, because everybody's about the money, the greed.
The students say that Tutuka has changed their lives.
It's about you and the people that you study with, how you can help each other out, and how you can make a difference in the society around you.
Matshidiso's book has been endorsed by former South African President Thabo Mbeki, an inspired writer himself.
The young poet says that when she first met former President Thabo Mbeki, she asked him what poetry was. He replied to her in an 8-page letter.
All in all, what he said in that letter was poetry is about imagination and being able to see the simplest of words and have people look at them in their own way and have them go like this to like this, you know, and it's in levels of your own imagination.
Matshidiso is not only getting the attention of political leaders, but celebrities too.
I'm going to go through your book, and you and I are going to choose the most suitable poem that we think can put some music to it.
Matshidiso will be traveling to the United States to study film once she's finished school. She wants to be a Hollywood film director. But Matshidiso says she loves South Africa and will return home to make stories about the country and will also pursue her goal of being an entrepreneur. Sumitra Nadu, CCTV, Johannesburg.
Right, quick run through the numbers for you across the 4 bourses that we track here on Africa Live, starting as usually do in Nigeria. The all-share index down by just under 0.2. The all-share index in South Africa in green territory, up 1.6%. It points the 20-share index still firmly in a bear run. Some commentators argue now this is a very good time to jump in and see what bargains there are to be picked up. And the EGX 30 also higher on the day, up 1.1 percentage points. On a broad perspective, however, Nigeria and Kenya up 35% year to date, South Africa about 6%, Egypt, however, down 11%. The real kicker, though, Ghana. The all-share index there is up by a massive 60%. That's BizAfrica for you today.